In this video lesson, we're going to be taking a look at performing operations and undoing operations. And we need to understand how this works in order to be successful when we solve multi-step equations. So before we get to the practice problems, I'd like to take a minute and briefly review some information from the textbook. First of all, let's talk about performing operations. We know that if a mathematical expression does not contain any parentheses or exponents, then we need to perform operations in this order. First, we need to perform multiplication and division, and we would do that from left to right. After we're finished doing that, then we would perform addition and subtraction, also doing that from left to right. Well, when we're solving equations and getting a variable by itself, that typically involves undoing operations, and we do that in reverse order. In other words, we typically undo addition and subtraction operations first, and then we undo multiplication and division operations after that. So we're going to see how that works with a couple of practice problems. The problems we're going to look at are right here, and for each equation we're going to begin by identifying the operations that are happening in the correct order, and after that we'll go ahead and solve the equation. Alright, so let's take a look at our first practice problem. Here's our first equation. 6x plus 3 equals negative 21. We're going to begin by identifying the operations performed on the variable x, and we need to make sure we do that with the correct order of operations. So let's do that now. The expression 6x plus 3 involves 6x, that means 6 times x, and then plus 3, that's an addition. So the first operation taking place here is multiplication. After the multiplication is done, then the addition operation is taking place. So now that we've identified that those are the operations that are taking place, we're ready to solve this equation by undoing those operations. So let's get the equation written down over here. Alright, there we go. 6x plus 3 equals negative 21. Let's go ahead and solve this equation. In order to solve this equation, we're going to have to undo the operations that are taking place on the left side in order to get x by itself. And because we're undoing operations in the reverse order, the first operation we have to undo is the adding 3. So the inverse of adding 3 is subtracting 3. That means the first step of solving this equation will be to subtract 3 on both sides. After I've subtracted 3 from both sides, my equation looks like this. 6x equals negative 24. Now I can undo the multiplication here, and the inverse of multiplying 6 would be dividing by 6. So we're going to divide both sides of this equation by 6. And after I've divided both sides by 6, I'm left with the equation x equals negative 4, and that shows me the solution of this equation. Let's move on to the next practice problem. Now we're looking at this equation. 3n over 4, that's a fraction, and then 7 is subtracted from that, and the result is 35. So we need to begin by identifying the operations in the correct order that are being performed on the variable n, and there are 3 operations in this case. So let's go ahead and identify those. The first operation that's occurring is actually happening in the numerator of the fraction here. We have 3n. That means n is being multiplied by 3. Now that 3n is over 4, and a fraction bar means we're dividing. So the second operation is dividing by 4. Finally, after multiplying 3 and dividing 4, the last operation occurring on the left side would be the minus 7. That means subtracting 7. Now that we've figured out the operations occurring, it's time to undo those operations and solve the equation. So let's get the equation written down. There we go. And it's time to solve the equation by undoing those operations. And just like we saw in the last problem, we want to undo operations in reverse order. So the first thing we have to undo is subtracting 7. The inverse operation would be to add 7. So we're going to add 7 on both sides of this equation. There we go. That gives us 3n over 4 equals 42. Now it's time to undo the dividing by 4. The inverse operation would be to multiply by 4. So let's do that on both sides. After we multiply both sides by 4, the equation looks like this. 3n equals 168. The last step would be to undo the multiplication by 3, and the inverse operation for that would be divide by 3. So let's divide both sides by 3. And when we divide both sides by 3, we're left with n equals 56. So the solution for this equation is 56. Now, there is an alternative approach to solving this equation, and I'm going to be looking at that next. This approach involves rewriting the expression 3n over 4 as 3/4 times n. We actually did this a little bit in lesson 1.1, so hopefully you've seen it already. When you have a fraction like this, 3n over 4, and the variable's in the numerator, as long as there's no additions or subtractions occurring in the numerator, you can actually move that variable over to the side like we've done in this expression here, 3/4 n. So we're going to take the equation 3/4 n minus 7 equals 35 and use that. So now that the equation's written this way, let's identify the operations performed on the variable n. All right. There are two operations occurring in this place. There's a multiplication and a subtraction. The first operation we see is n being multiplied by 3/4. After that, 7 is being subtracted. Now that we've identified the operations, it's time to undo those operations and solve the equation. So here's the equation, 3/4 n minus 7 equals 35. Let's go ahead and solve this. Just like we've done in the past, we will undo the operations in reverse order. So the first operation we have to undo is subtract 7. The inverse of that would be to add 7. So we'll go ahead and add 7 on both sides. That gives us the equation 3/4 times n equals 42. Now we can undo the multiplication of 3/4. And to undo multiplication by a fraction, we actually use the reciprocal of that. So we're going to multiply both sides by the reciprocal of 3/4. That would be 4/3. So I'm multiplying 4/3 on both sides. Of course, on this side, we're cross-canceling everything, which leaves us with 1 n, or just plain n. On the right side, we can do a little reducing here. 3 on the bottom of the first fraction and 42 on the top, and that reduces down to 14 up here, and 1. So 4 times 14 is going to end up giving us 56. And so at this point I'm done solving, and once again I see that the solution is 56. So that concludes this lesson on undoing operations and solving multi-step equations.